Welcome back to another video, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our macOS development with AppKit tutorial series, and in this particular tutorial we are going to be taking a look at how we can create an NSTableView in AppKit. Excuse me. So this is going to be a little bit longer of a video because it's a little bit longer of a process, but I'm going to try to go through it as quickly as possible without it like being overwhelming, because again we have a lot to cover. So let's get right into it. We're going to go into Xcode, and I'm going to quickly check to make sure the font is okay. Alright, so we should be okay. Now, first thing that we need is a model to contain the data that we're going to show in our table. Because an NSTableView is essentially a view that has columns and rows, different from UITableView in UIKit, if you're familiar with that, where it only has rows consisting of cells, a singular column with a bunch of cells as its rows. But NSTableView, of course, has been around significantly longer. It's been around from the very beginning. All right. And in order to populate a table, we need a model. So go ahead and create a model class. In this case, it's going to be movie for me. Excuse me. This model is going to have multiple properties. It's going to have two string properties. It's going to have the title for a movie and the director for the movie. There's going to be a integer property for its release year. There's going to be a computed property to convert that release year integer to a string for use in the actual table cell, and then there's going to be an ID to identify that movie. So let's go ahead and actually create this class. So we'll say class movie NSObject. Now, why am I inheriting from NSObject? Well, there's a few reasons. The first being that this prevents any possible future issues with interoperability with Objective-C, and it also allows us to use key value coding and key value observing, or KVC and KVO, for things like Cocoa bindings and stuff like that. Well, we're not covering Cocoa bindings yet. That'll be a little bit further down the line. But in order to use those, we have to inherit from NSObject. So I'm just getting ahead of that by inheriting from it. There isn't any additional work to be done because NSObject does a lot of that stuff behind the scenes as kind of as sort of a base class of sorts inside of Foundation. So let's go ahead and create all these properties. Var ID, it's going to be a UUID. Var title, it's going to be a string. Var director is going to be a string. Var release year is going to be an int. Var release year string is going to be a string, and we're going to return string with release year, pass to it as a parameter, and then finally we're going to have an initializer where we're going to initialize all of our properties. This is basic Swift. You should already know how to do this sort of thing where you're constructing a basic class. Init title string director is also a string. release year, and there we go. In here, we're then going to say self ID equals UUID, self title equals title, self director equals director, self release year equals release year. All right. And that's it. That is our model. Pretty simple. It's just a basic class. Now, in my constants file, I have an array of movies that we're going to use inside of our view controller. So I'm going to go into our constants file here. And you can see the 6 movies that I have here. Now, below the movies here, let's create a couple string constants because we're going to need these. And we'll say static let title column ID equals movie underscore title, static let director column ID equals movie underscore director, and static let release column ID equals movie underscore release underscore YR for year. And there we go. Now, these constants are going to be used as the what's called a raw value for the column identifiers in our table. So let's go ahead and save this code. We're going to go to our view controller. And what we have here pretty much is a view that has its background color set to black. And we have 4 UI controls so far. We have 3 text fields and a button. This is for when we talk about dynamically adding rows to our table. That'll be in the next video. So we just have the UI set up for that already. These controls will be along the top of our window. All right. And you can see I already have my data variable here. So var data is equal to constants.movies. Pretty simple stuff so far. Let's go ahead and create our NSTableView. All right. So to create our NSTableView, we can say var, let's say table equals NSTableView, like that, with an empty initializer. Inside of configure, we are going to say table.translates auto resizing mask into constraints, like that. And now we're going to configure our table. So to configure our table, the first and most important thing we're going to need are table columns. So in here, we can say well, let's go back up to the top here actually and define them underneath our table. So var title column equals NS table column, and this is going to need an identifier. Now this takes in an NS user interface item identifier. This is simply the object that AppKit will use to identify our columns. So we can say NS user interface item identifier. And we want a raw value. We'll say constants dot title column ID, like that. And then it'll be the same story. Instead of title column here, we'll have director column. And then we'll change the raw value here. We'll have director column ID, like that. And then for our third column, instead of title column, it'll be release year column. Okay. So dot release column ID. There we go. All right, there we go. So now that we have our columns, let's go back into configure. And in here, we're going to say table dot add table column. Title column, table, add table column, director column, and table dot add table column, release year column. All right, so there we go. We've added our columns to the table, so it has those now. And then here, we can go through some of these properties here and talk about what they are. So we don't want selected row, but that basically gets the specific row that was selected. We can say click row, header view, reload data for a specific set of rows, all that kind of stuff. But the property that we want is title. So dot title equals, or not the table here. It'll be title column dot title. We'll set this equal to movie title. Director column dot title equals name of director, and release year column dot title equals release year, like that. Okay, and now that should theoretically be all that we need for our table and column configurations. Next, we need to add, excuse me, we need to add our table as a subview to the view. So view, add subview, and here we'll give it the table. We don't need to add the columns as subviews because those are added to the table, not the view. Go ahead and save that. There we go. Now that that's done, let's go ahead and quickly add the constraints for the table, which are pretty simple constraints. We're gonna have to go all the way down here. All right. Now let's do table dot top anchor dot constraint equal to, let's say, title field dot bottom anchor with a constant of 20, like that. And then we can say table dot trailing anchor dot constraint is equal to view trailing anchor. Table bottom anchor dot constraint is equal to view bottom anchor, and then table dot leading anchor dot constraint is equal to view leading anchor, like that. Okay, so I think, let's go into my issue navigator here just to quickly fix this problem. Okay. Okay. I didn't actually give it a value. Translates autumn resizing mask into constraints. That should be false. Okay. All right. Now that that's complete, the last thing that we need to do is give this a delegate and data source, and then there's stuff we need to do inside of that. So we're going to set the delegate and data source for our table view to we're going to make this view controller those, right? So before we do that, let's talk briefly about what the delegate and data source for a table view are. Well, this is using what's called the delegate and protocols communication pattern. I've discussed this a little bit already, but you can think of it as an intern boss analogy, where the intern does the work, the boss assigns the work, but doesn't care how it's being done, and so the boss is the protocol. It's the list of instructions that the intern is being given by the boss. The boss calls the methods. The intern does the work and actually, performs that work. Okay, it's pretty simple stuff. Let's go ahead and create an extension on View Controller after we assign the delegate and data source properties of our table. So in our configure method, we'll say table.delegate is equal to self, and table.data source equals self. All right. So now that we've told our table view where it can find its delegate and data source methods for it to call whenever they need to call them, we need to actually implement those methods that it calls. Otherwise, Xcode is going to yell at us. So inside of our project navigator, I'm going to, create a new file. I'm going to create a new Swift file, and this is going to be view controller plus table delegate and data source ext. All right, we're going to save that file. And now inside of this file here, we're going to import Cocoa. All right. After we import Cocoa, we're going to say extension view controller, and then we're going to add protocol conformances for NSTableView delegate and NSTableView data source. All right, there we go. Now, the first method that we need is from the data source, and this data source method is going to tell the table view how many rows it has in the data. So we'll say number of rows in table view. Now, all right, so this is going to return an integer, which again is the number of rows, as the function signature implies, that there's going to be in the table view. So we'll say return data.count. Now, if you don't remember what data is, it is the variable up at the top of our view controller that has all of the movies stored in it. It's an array of movies. And we just need to get the count property so we know how many rows there are going to be. All right. Pretty simple stuff. And now, finally, we can add our method for setting up the different cells in our table view. So it will be view for cell at or rather it'll be okay, no, that's not the case. Okay, so I should have this already brought up in Safari. There it is. I can copy that and paste it in. Do that. Okay. Now, what does this method actually do? Well, what this method will do is it will effectively allow us to create a table cell view, and then it will return that as an optional NS view that we can use inside of our table. Now we can see that we pasted the method signature in, but it's a little bit. It's not great looking. So we're going to go ahead and kind of fix this up just a smidgen. All right. All right. All right, so we should be okay. Now, inside of this method, there's one thing we need to keep in mind, is that when we actually create our cells, there's a process that we need to go through. And that process pretty much is if a cell already exists, then we'll just return the cell, a recycled version of the cell that already exists. Otherwise, we need to create the cell manually. All right, so let's go ahead and say, we'll say if let cell equals table view dot make view with identifier, and this is going to take the identifier of our column. Now, because we know our table column has an identifier, and it's not optional for whatever reason, we can say table column exclamation point dot identifier, and we can say nil for the owner. That's fine. And let's open that up. So what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, if a cell for the specific column identifier exists, then give us that cell. Otherwise, if it's nil, then we know it doesn't exist yet, right? So what this is what makeView is doing pretty much is it's saying if it exists, we'll recycle the view and give it different content based on the data that we provide the table. Otherwise, we need to actually create that ourselves. So in this case, we know it exists, so we'll say return cell, like that. Else, if we reach the else clause, or you could just not have an else clause altogether and reduce indentation, we need to first create an NS text field. And so we'll say we'll say cell content equals NS text field label with string, and in here we're going to say well, I guess what we'll do instead here is we'll say let cell content equals NS text field cell content dot draws background equals false, cell content dot is bezeled equals false, cell content dot is editable is also equal to false, cell content dot is bezeled is also equal to false. So we've set up our text field now. We should also say cell content dot translates auto resizing mask into constraints is going to be false. All right. And so now we are going to switch on the table column dot identifier dot raw value. We'll say case constants dot title column ID. So if the column that we're iterating over for this row is the title column, what we'll do is we'll say cell content dot string value is equal to data row dot title, like that. Nothing too complicated. Same thing goes for constants dot director column ID. So if it's the director column, then we will say cell content dot string value equals data at the given row dot director. Then we will finally have case constants dot release column ID, and we'll say for this one cell contents dot string value is going to be equal to data at the given row dot release your string. And then for our default case, we'll say cell content dot string value is equal to an empty string, like that. Okay, now that we've configured the cell's contents, we actually need to configure the table cell view. So let cell view equals ns table cell view. All right. Now that we have our table cell view, we need to actually go ahead and say cell view dot add subview, and that'll be cell contents, and cell view dot text field is also cell content. There we go. Because when you set the text field property on a cell view, that doesn't add it as a subview to, that doesn't add the cell content as a subview to the cell. You actually need to manually add it, which we did here. All right, and then the last thing is to enable the constraints. So we'll say ns layout constraint dot activate and in here it'll be pretty much cell content dot top anchor dot constraint is equal to view dot, not view, it'll be cell view dot top anchor cell content dot trailing anchor dot constraint is equal to cell view dot trailing anchor cell content dot bottom anchor dot constraint is equal to cell view dot bottom anchor okay, yep, and then finally cell content dot leading anchor dot constraint is equal to cell view dot leading anchor. All right, and now that that's done, once we have our constraints, we can return cell view like that. All right. So let's go ahead and save that and run our code now. We get a build failure, so let's fix whatever we screwed up here. Okay. Okay, CONSTRA. Okay. Now let's run it. Okay, we still have a build failure. Okay. Okay. Constraint. Okay. There we go. Now we have a successful build. Let it kind of run and do its thing here. It's got to build it. All right, so here we go. Here's our table. And inside of our table, you can see all 6 of our movies with all of its data. All right, so with that, that's pretty much how we create a table view and populate it with pre-existing data. Let's briefly go over again what we did. So, the first thing that we did was we created a model. This model inherits from NSObject, which gives us many benefits, including allowing us to later on use Cocoa bindings to more effectively use our table view, which we'll take a look at a later point. It also allows us to have better interoperability with Objective-C and its associated APIs. The next thing that we did was we put our actual table in the user interface, created its columns, and added those columns to the table view. Then we created the data source and delegate objects for our table. In this case, we're using the view controller as its delegate and data source object. And in order to do that, we've created an extension that conforms our view controller to NSTableView delegate and NSTableView data source. We then, inside of our extension, told our table view how many rows we have based on the data in the number of rows in table view function from the data source protocol. And then we are using a view for table column at row from our delegate to specify what the contents of each cell should be. If we've already created a cell with the given column identifier before, then we recycle the cell and put new content inside of it. Otherwise, we create the cell manually and then we return that newly created cell for later reuse. All right, so that pretty much does it for this video, guys, on NSTableView. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave them down in the comments or on Twitter, because I know this is a complicated topic. I know this was a pretty long video, and I had to blaze through some of it just so we could, just to make it as short as possible. But with something like this, it's a little bit more complicated, right? So thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.